Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and why the best writers risk being strange. And today I want to do something. I'm here today in my home office where you can see a nice Opeth record. If you're looking at the video, you can see Bad Mouse and his other friend, also named Bad Mouse. You can, if I were to move my camera, you can see the crows. Those are the crows that bring me my ideas. And of course, you can see a bunch of boxes. I'm in the sort of middle of a bunch of renovation projects in this office. In the future, you'll see some nice, maybe not nice, but some cabinets back there and so on. But right now, it's a bit of a mess if you're looking at the video. But you may want to look at the video just to see some pretty covers of books I'm going to show you. You don't need to, of course. But I am going to talk about some books. This is the premise of today's podcast is books for creative writers. And I'm going to walk through a series of books that I recommend for creative writers. I've got a big pile of books here. So, and I'm going to go through 13 books. Why 13 books? Well, it's Halloween coming up, lucky 13. But also, I was asked by a student the other day, to recommend some books for a creative writer. And I said to him, sounds like a great idea. You know what? I already talked about this podcast on a podcast. I'll just send you the podcast. And then, of course, I looked and I was wrong. I have done a podcast on screenwriting books. So if you're interested in screenwriting books, you can search, in your podcast app, the archives of the show, or search on YouTube, on our YouTube channel for the archives of the show. And then you'll find, my recommendations for screenwriting books. A couple of those I'll duplicate here today, but otherwise, this is a more broad and general set of book recommendations for creative writers. So I'm thinking about creative writing in a broader and more general sense, but premising this whole idea on, of course, primarily as a writer, you're going to be writing books in some form. Or, if you're not writing books, if you're writing other creative projects, there may be some crossover with books. Books tend to be at the heart of what a writer does for a variety of reasons. But whatever type of creative writer you are, I think, these books will be useful to you. So I'm sort of giving you a broad base here. Again, 13 books is a significant amount of books. I'm just going to kind of walk through them one by one, my recommendations here. And I'll talk a little bit about why I recommend these books as I do it. So thank you for the suggestion. And in the future, this is my official, recommendation for you. If you are a creative writer, where should you start in terms of creative writing books? Now, I'll note here that I am writing a creative writing book, as the podcast title suggests. I want to write a book called Writing the Wrong Way. And I have sort of other creative writing books, some half in draft and so on. Since I am currently writing them, it would behoove you to let me know what you want in those books. So please, if you are a writer, if you are a creative writer especially, if you are interested in any aspect of writing or creative writing, whether we're talking about editing or writing or business issues related to writing, any problems you have, any suggestions you have, any just things you want to know, you can always email me, and please do email me through strangerfiction.ca. If you go to strangerfiction.ca, you can fill out the form, send me an email. So please do that, especially if you are a writer. I really do want, your suggestions on books or topics that you want in writing books. So again, I'm working on some of these projects, but right now I can't recommend you my writing book since it doesn't exist. So I'm going to instead recommend a number of other books. I'm not really doing this in any particular order, but here they are. So the first book I really recommend is a lesser known book called Art and Fear. So this is Art and Fear. It's by David Bales and Ted Orland. And the subtitle of this book is Observations on the Perils and Rewards of Art Making. So Art and Fear. So it's a bit more of a mindset book in some respects. Um, and it kind of is more focused around work habits. And although it does have some creative, issues involved, this is a good book, Art and Fear, not just for a creative writer, but an artist of any type. And one of the sort of things that Bales and Orland do at the start of this book is they discuss what they consider a problem almost on a scandal level, which is that most artists, or rather, most people who train as artists, so most people who go in to an art program at university or college or take some other specialized training, if you go and look at them years later, when they come out of the program, they are not working as artists. And Bales and Orland attribute this to a variety of reasons, and they kind of run through what they see as the common reasons, the common problems that people have making it in some way, shape, or another as an artist, whether they're professional problems that people run into, whether they're creative problems that people run into, whether they're career problems, that people run into, or what. They kind of just run through, some of the problems, ordinary problems, unusual problems. And they give some advice in the book about sort of how to think differently as an artist, how to deal with the industries that you kind of end up engaging with as you're trying to be an artist. They get into just a lot of the factors that can prevent you from being an artist. So in this case, when we're talking about creative writing, a lot of the issues that prevent you from becoming a creative writer. And always say, I hate to be negative in a certain sense, but I always like to start with that issue, because I think when the fundamental issues that writers have and other artists have is there is a lack of structures that enables you to continue being an artist. And a lot of your struggle as an artist is simply remaining an artist. A lot of the problems you face as a writer are problems of continuing to be a writer. And there is a level, because the industry changes so much, because the market changes so much, because technology changes so much, things are always changing. And the constant thing that sort of pervades all change, the sort of continual issue that you'll run into, um, in addition to maybe some temporary issues that you might run into for here and there, the continual issue that you face as a writer usually is, how do you not quit? And what you find in a lot of the creative fields is, if you cannot quit, you will ultimately do well. There's a certain level where the success isn't guaranteed in any way, whether we're talking career success or creative success or artistic success or financial success. I mean, none of those things are guaranteed, but they all become more likely and they all become more possible if you don't quit. I like to sort of jokingly sum this idea up as, to be a writer, a successful writer, you just have to do two things: not quit and not die. But if you have to do one of those things, dying is easier to come back from as a creative writer. It's easier to die and come back than quitting prior to your death. You can be Kafka and have a whole fantastic career beyond your death, or Lovecraft have a fantastic career beyond your death. Uh, but all the people who quit partway through that process, very few of them go on to have any level of career. Strangely, you can die and have a fantastic career, but quitting, it is harder to overcome. So, on that sort of broad topic of mindset and different ways of thinking, I sometimes will recommend this book, The War of Art. So, this is a more standard book you probably have heard of, War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, subtitle of which is Break Through the Blocks and Win Your Inner Creative Battles. What I like about this book is it has a sort of aphoristic nature. So, it's very narrative in the sense that Pressfield sort of spends a lot of time telling you the story of how he sort of became a writer. And Pressfield has a really interesting career as a writer, which is worth, digging into. When you read the book, you'll sort of see some of it. Um, Pressfield did some screenwriting. He did, novel writing. He's working now he's a nonfiction author of some note. He's worked in a lot of capacities as a writer, but he's also had a very strange kind of life, and he's had a lot of problems in his life that he's had to overcome in order to be a writer. I don't like certain aspects of Pressfield's approach, but I do think, broadly speaking, it's a really good book to get into that headspace that I think you need to be in, or it helps to be in as a creative writer, which is the headspace of, working. A lot of the problems that creative writers have, I will contend, has to do with the fact that they think writing is something different from other things. So, writing, I often say, is not an art. Literature is an art. Poetry is an art. Novels are artistic. But writing itself is a craft process, and you have to really think about it the way you would think about digging a ditch. You have to take that same approach. You dig a little bit each day. You figure out where you're going to dig the ditch. You get your tools. You start digging. You dig until you're done. If you can't dig it all at once, you dig a little bit here, a little bit later. You deal with problems. If it starts to rain and the hole starts to fill in, you got to come up with a strategy to get that hole dug. Once it's dug, maybe you got to buttress it. There's things you got to do, but they're not mystical. You don't have to be inspired to dig the ditch, but you may need a shovel. And so there is a level where Pressfield has that pragmatic approach. He talks a little too mystically for me, like my sort of contention. This book is divided into a couple parts, and I would argue that the earlier parts are much better than the later parts. If I remember the book correctly, that's how it's divided. There's a sort of portion of the book that is a very mystical sounding, and he really believes in the muse in fundamental ways. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad approach to take, although I don't believe in it. But he has this way that he anthropomorphizes certain concepts like resistance and blocks. He sort of anthropomorphizes them in a certain way that I don't agree with, but I think they work. It works to think about resistance in that way. It works to think about inspiration in that way. I'm always more interested in what works than whether I agree with a thing. And the reality of the Pressfield's War of Art is he's right about the approach you have to take. You have to sort of take an egoless approach of giving yourself up to the project. Putting yourself in service of the muse in the sort of terms he would explain it in. You have to sort of understand, the problems of the world are arrayed against you in a certain respect. And you need to deal with the fact that these forces are arrayed against you. And in an ironic way in which fighting it doesn't help, but sort of breaking it down to a sort of daily disciplined practice, whether it's really daily or weekly or whatever, you have to have a sort of mindset of work, mindset of discipline, a practice that you put in place. You have to have this level of forgiveness that you offer to yourself when things go wrong, and so on. So it's a bit more focused on these disciplines, how to do a thing versus, say, art and fear, where it's more about how to not do the thing. Art and fear is very much kind of, I think, dealing with first what you got to deal with, which is how do you get out of your own way, and how do you get other things out of your way, and how do you continue as an artist. And then the Pressfield's War of Art is a bit more focused on, okay, how do I then be an artist? What are the things, again, that I have to deal with particularly as a writer, although as any sort of artist. So then along the same lines of these, large kind of creative uh, approaches or ways to think about creativity, I've really been enjoying Rick Rubin's The Creative Act. So this is a book that Rick Rubin, this is a more recent book that Rick Rubin has put out. You may have seen him flogging it all over the place. And again, it's a little mystical for my tastes. I'm a hardcore, hardline atheist who is also materialist, and so on. So sometimes it rubs me the wrong way, these books, when they kind of get into these mystical concepts and ways of thinking. At the same time, I recognize that those ways of thinking work. And also, despite the sort of mystical sheen, despite the sort of appearance and the sheen, the pretensions of mysticism that sometimes Rubin has, is a very practical book. He really does delve into, I think, the right attitude to have, and the right set of processes to put in place, the kind of way of creating. So ways to think about the creative act, ways to kind of organize your space and your life and your mind in order to better create. Just practical tips on how to deal with situations like being stuck, creativity in all its forms, and how to sort of enable creativity rather than enabling it. These are the sorts of things that Rubin is really addressing, sometimes with a bit of a mystical sheen, but other times, he's very practical and nuts and bolts. And the thing that I sometimes will say that I think all three of those books address, although in different ways, is when you're a writer or a creative person of some sort, you have to do what I call living like a vampire. And what I mean by that is you have to recognize that the world is not for you. This world is set up in a way that rewards a creature who is not you. The world isn't made for vampires, right? The world is made for humans. And if when the vampire comes along, yes, the vampire has certain abilities. Yes, the vampire has a level of power. Yes, the vampire can do things that these puny mortals cannot do. Yes, the vampire has potential immortality, in their grasp. But the world's not made for the vampire. The world is, in fact, arrayed against the vampire. And the problem you get into very quickly when you're a vampire is, how do you live amongst humans? How do you deal with a world that is not made for you, that in fact is actively hostile to your presence? Um, that's in many ways the problem that you have as a creative person, in particular as a creative writer, because a lot of the things in the world are structured in to work for people in a way that won't work for you. And so there's no real bemoaning of the fact, you're just where you are. And you have to sort of deal with where you are in the history, in the culture, in the world, and so on, in capitalism. But you have to understand that things are not built for you. And so everything, and so many things, it's the opposite of what would work for you. Instead of doing X, you have to do not X if you want it to work. So there's a lot of mindset shifts that are involved. There's a lot of practical matters to contend with when you're a vampire. Again, one of these days I'll write a book called Living Like a Vampire. But until then, you can read The Creative Act, The War of Art, and Art and Fear. Now, bringing it a little down for the clouds a bit, another sort of book that I think is really important in terms of understanding kind of where you are as a writer and how you should approach writing in a kind of broad sense is this book, 21 Insights for 21st Century Creatives. So this is a book by Mark McGinnis. And it's a very slim book. It's got, again, 21 little short essays in which he deals with a lot of different topics. And again, a lot of them are broad topics. What I mean by that is this is, again, a book that's more for just a generally creative person than necessarily a book that's specific to creative writers. It's not a craft book. Is a bit more of a career book and a bit more of a businessy book and a bit more about, again, the kind of mindset you sort of need to adopt to do well as a creative artist in the world today. And so he's got some very broad things to say. He's got some more specific things to say. And a lot of it is, it's much more practical a book. I mean, it's a high concept book in many respects, but I think it has a greater practicality to it in terms of how you should think about uh, organizing yourself, organizing your career, organizing your day, organizing your time, uh, thinking about motivation, thinking about money, thinking about business approaches, and things of that nature. Again, I know, probably contrary to what you might think, clicking on the title of this episode, 13 books for creative writers. Again, I recognize that these books I'm presenting you with so far are not specifically for creative writers. And some of them aren't even super creative. Some of them are much more focused on just how to think about things differently, how to look at the world differently, how to organize your day and your time and think about your mindset, even just think about money differently. That's the harder stuff, frankly. The writing's craft issues are relatively simple. And what I mean by that is, sure, craft can get complex. Sure, artistry is complicated, but the core of it is not complicated. And the core of it is not complex. And the um, regular practice of things is not necessarily difficult in and of itself. Details of it get difficult, but the broad thing is, it's not that it's easy, but it's very doable. The really difficult thing is taking a different approach to things, taking a different way of looking at things. The biggest problem you have as a writer is unlearning all the things that the humans have taught you, right? You want to live like a vampire. You have to unlearn what the humans have taught you. And you have to think about things in a different way. And this includes, dispelling myths about creativity that you've been taught. So there's sort of a class of things you should understand, or you do understand, you think you understand rather, about creative writing that you need to unlearn. You need to realize that so much of the myths of the world, so much of the things you think you know about creative writing and about being an artist are lies that have been sold to you. And then the other thing you need to understand also is a lot of the economic realities of the world don't apply to you. And what I mean by that is there's very different ways that you have to think about things when you're a creator versus when you're going to a job. And of course, the world is structured to train you to go to jobs. This is the rest of the world. It's unfortunate because most of us don't have jobs in the traditional sense, or and never will. I sometimes will say to people, the educational system is structured today to train you to work in a factory, but there are no factories. That is a bygone era in many respects. If there's a factory, it moved to China, right? And sure, there's the pretense that they're going to come bring the factories back, but realistically, it's not what it seems to be. And there's pros and cons about these factory jobs, and not to put down a factory job exactly, but writing isn't a factory job. It's a very different thing. Economically, it's a very different thing. Intellectually, in terms of intellectual property, it's a very different thing. So legalistically, it's a very different thing. It's just, you know, it has more in common with running a small company. In fact, it is running a small company than it has to with, this model that you will learn in school often of, hey, you write something, people give you money. Uh, it's not really your goal as a writer in many respects, although it may seem like it's your goal. And of course, that's the pressure from the society. So 21 Insights for 21st Century Creatives, I find it a nice balance of, ideas maybe that you haven't had before, different ways to think about things. It's a nice soft introduction to business, and not that it has a lot of business information in it, but that it has a bit of a soft introduction to how you need to think differently as a creative person who's trying to have a career in the arts. It doesn't get you too deep into that, but it gives you a nice scattershot look at a bunch of different approaches, from, motivation to how to be productive in a day to how to think differently about um, your job. What is your job when you're a creative writer? What does it really mean to not have a job and to kind of work for yourself? And what are the sort of things you need to think about and maybe think differently about? Along similar lines, although it is, I'll warn you, that's out of date. Jeff Vandermeer has a great, or used to be a great book called Book Life. So some of this book right now is skippable. I wish that he would put a new edition of this book out. If he has put a new edition of this book out and I don't know about it, please let me know and, check out that edition instead. But Book Life is a book that Vandermeer published some time ago. So again, a lot of it is published in 2009, which is ages ago in the creative industries, given the changes in technology and how marketing works and so on. But it's still a good book. It still has a lot in it to recommend. And what I like about the Vandermeer book in particular is he makes this core distinction between what he calls public book life and private book life. Because one of the things you have to get used to if you're going to write and to put things out there, so be a creative person. So one of the core things you have to get used to is the fact that you're a public figure now in a certain sense. Perhaps you're a public figure nobody knows about, cares about, but you are a public figure and you have to sort of realize this. And it's a different type of being a public figure than it is like just having a Twitter feed and being out in the public in that way. Um, there's a whole set of issues that revolve around professionalism. Pressfield also gets into a lot of that. Pressfield makes this distinction between the amateur and the professional. But his distinction is more of a moral distinction. Yes, there is a sort of work difference. He gets into sort of the practical things that it means to be a professional and how, you practically to be, have a career in creative industries, need to be professional in certain respects. But again, Pressfield is making this more really of a moral distinction. Vandermeer is being very practical. This is a very practical book. It does get a little bit into the mystical, not the mystical side of things, but the abstract side of things. Like, again, what's the difference between your public and your private life? What do you put out in the world versus what do you do without the eyes of the world on you? It's very practical. It helps. I found this as a useful book to really steer around things like how do I network? How do I make use of, uh, branding? How do I, you know, just deal with basic issues like, whether or not my family supports me. So he has a lot to say about these things. I think a lot of the book still holds up. I wish all the book held up. I wish Jeff Vandermeer would make a new edition of this book, which because it is really has the potential to be a fantastic core book that people should use as a standard. But it's a little too out of date to give it 100% endorsement that way. But Book Life is a great uh, place, even to start. If you're really kind of wondering, okay, how do I get out of my head and take these broad ideas and really kind of translate them into practical things? How do I really, yes, yes, yes. Rick Rubin has a lot of interesting things to say about, the attitude I need to take to be receptive to creativity. But how do I actually translate that into a career? Book Life is a bit more focused around that sort of thing. And again, it's sort of has its weaknesses, but there's a lot of strengths in what he's suggesting and saying. Now, I will soon, I promise you, start offering you books that will help you with your craft. Soon, I promise you, I will offer you books that will help you be a better writer on that artistic level. But not yet. Instead, I'm going to offer you a very unlikely candidate. And uh, it is the Canadian Legal Guide for Small Business. The Canadian Legal Guide for Small Business by Nishwan Suez. Now, if you're not Canadian, you'll want to find some other book along the same lines. Why do I suggest this book? I think the thing you really, which by the way has nothing to do with creative work at all. What writers fail to realize, and the thing that is at the heart of many of the writers' problems, particularly their career problems, is a lot of writers, they like to write, they think they have something to say, they think they have, an interesting take on things, they have, stories to tell. That, of course, is the core and the prime thing. And you know, what happens though, if you have any level of success, big or small, is you immediately start to come up against barriers and problems. And the reason these barriers and problems present themselves are typically because you are a business legally. Whether you're making money or not, as far as the government is concerned, you are a business and you're engaged in the activity of a business. And therefore, especially if you start making money, but sometimes even if you don't, you get into the whole complexity of the law, particularly copyright law, and sometimes tax law. So tax laws matter. The copyright law matters. There's all sorts of contractual law that begins to matter. And you can very quickly, without realizing it, move into a strange space. I'll give you a simple example. Let's imagine that you and another person co-write a story together. And you just have an idea, you've been talking about this idea together, you're excited about it, and you make the story together. And let's imagine, that the story gets published. Maybe you get, $20 for publishing the story. You're so excited about it. You guys, two of you go out and grab some sushi. The sushi costs you $30, but hey, we got like two-thirds of our sushi paid for. Isn't that cool? Isn't that fun? Well, imagine, what happens next is you go on to do other things in your life. You write some other books, you write some other things. Maybe you lose touch with that other person. Who knows? One thing that you don't realize is that because you co-wrote that story, you're in a legal partnership. And in this situation, you have no contract or rules, you have no agreement in place to govern your legal partnership. Why would you? You think there's no point. We just wrote a little story together. But the reality of this legal partnership means that any one of you can fully bind the other by making decisions about the intellectual property. The weird thing in Canada, and again, not legal advice, laws may have changed since I last looked at them, and so on. But in Canada, you have often this situation, and this is true elsewhere too, where in a partnership, either of the people have a 100% interest in the product. And it sounds strange to say that, but it has a certain legality to it. And so what that means is, let's say you and I co-wrote a story, and then, you take off and do other things in your life. I can go and try to, without your knowledge, sell that story, uh, say, sell the film rights. Sure, you might be entitled to money if the film rights get sold. That's debatable. But probably you have a claim on the money. But you think, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem you get into very quickly, very potentially, very fast is there could be money coming in that you're not aware of. You could be liable to pay taxes on that money, and you don't even have the money. You don't even know it exists. You've got somebody signing contracts on your behalf that you wouldn't sign, but they can sign those contracts because you don't have an agreement saying they can't sign those contracts. And there's all sorts of other weird, scenarios that you get into. Oftentimes, a writer will hire a person to do something. Let's say I'm a writer and I want to break into comics. I hire the artist and I say, hey, here's a bunch of money, make some art for me. They agree. They say, yes, great. They make the pages for you. And, you think all is good. You go on, you get the comic published. You already paid them for the art. You own it, right? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It really depends. Really depends on a lot of factors. And the reality of all of this stuff is you can end up because you are a business, whether you like it or not. One, you have certain advantages as a business. And there's different types of business. You may or may not be one of the different types of business. Two, you could have multiple businesses and not even be aware of it. Three, you can be under tax obligations and not be aware of them, but you'll become aware of them because at some point the tax man cometh. There's also the issue of, you may have a lot of positive things that could happen. For example, you may be eligible to reduce your tax bill and not be aware of it. But regardless of the situation you're in, you are a business and you are liable as a business to conduct yourself in accordance with the laws relating to businesses. And you can get into a lot of trouble really fast if you don't know what you're doing. And so it is worth it. It behooves you as a writer to understand basic things about how contracts work, to understand how intellectual property law works, to understand how work for hire works, to understand how partnerships work, to understand the different business structures that can be in place or are in place, whether you like it or not. And to understand what is and isn't a taxable event. These things, yes, they're very complicated. Yes, it's not going to be possible for you to fully understand them all. Yes, you need to get the advice sometimes of a lawyer or an accountant or some other person in professional capacities like that. But the reality of the situation is, you have to deal with these things or someone else will deal with them for you. You'll die and your kids will fight over things because it's not in your will. You'll have a tax person come at you because even though you didn't get any money, on paper you made money. You can have weird situations like on paper you made money and on paper you owe taxes. for money you never received. That sort of thing is very common. It can become very problematic very fast. But also on the positive side of it, and I would like to stress the positive side in this instance, because you are a business, because the government will recognize you as a business, because you're engaged in the activity of doing business, even if you are not making any money, you can be eligible for a lot of savings. You can be eligible for tax credits. You can be eligible for tax reductions. The tax from your normal, maybe you got a day job and you're writing on the side. The money you make and it gets taxed away from you at your day job, you could get some of that back potentially because you've got this side gig where you're making no money as a writer. It really depends on a lot of factors like where you live, what your citizenship is, what laws are applicable, and so on. But the reality is, you need to start thinking of yourself as a business. Even though you want the art to be prime, the business needs to support the art making. You have to kind of make sure you're doing things in a way where it's not going to catch up to you in this possibly negative fashion. And it's going to structure your day and structure yourself, structure your life to enable your artwork. There's a lot of things that you can do for yourself to make writing easier on you if you understand, how that all works. But writers typically don't. So you need a primer of some sort. That's the one I recommend for Canadians. But you need some sort of primer wherever you're at on these matters. Now let's get into some more actual creative works. I'm going to share a screen for those of you who are watching. I've been shown, of course. There's another Vandermeer book I love to recommend, which is Wonder Book, the illustrated guide to creating imaginative fiction. Now, this is one where Vandermeer has revised it, although ironically, it requires less revision. This is the one book he didn't have to revise, but he did revise it. I wish he would revise the book he does have to revise, but he doesn't seem to care about that book as much. So I can see why, honestly. If you only get one creative writing book, I would say get this creative writing book. It's a visually beautiful book. It is very exhaustive. It has a lot of material, craft material. It has a lot of information in it. It really has a nice way of synthesizing information from other sources. So there's a lot of, places where he's drawing on other books and other writers about, who are in this whole creative writing space. It's also a book that is focused around fiction and storytelling that proceeds from the assumption that you may want to write fantasy, science fiction, and other of those types of genres. Most creative writing books proceed from the assumption that you want to write realism. And I personally feel that that is a mistake. So there's a lot of reasons I think that, which we don't need to get into. But this is a refreshing book relative to other creative writing books because it sort of starts from the assumption that you don't want to just replicate the world. You don't want to just write about the things you see, but you want to imagine things that no one has seen. And it has, a real, I think, ambition and a real scope and scale that a lot of creative writing books lack because they're, just less good, frankly. They're more contained. They're more niche. This is a book that is very expansive. Anything you want to do is covered in this book in some way, shape, or form. It's really a fantastic book. Plus, it's just a joy to read, and it's a beautiful, full color, fully illustrated book. Although it is, chock full of words as well. So if you only pick one book as a creative writer, I would really advise Wonder Book. It's the book to beat, in my opinion, for creative writers. And another book that I really like to advise to people is a little more narrow, but it's Alan Moore's book. What am I doing? I'm showing you the wrong things. Alan Moore's book, Writing for Comics. Now, if you don't want to write for comics, you might think, well, why read this book? Well, I would still say read this book because it's Alan Moore, one of the great writers in any medium, but especially in comics. Alan Moore is, I think, inarguably the greatest comics writer that has ever been. And unfortunately, the greatest one that still is. I say unfortunately because, you really would have hoped that somebody would have come along to beat Moore. And I'm trying, but, it hasn't happened yet. Alan Moore's Writing for Comics is a fantastic book. It's hard to find. So I will kind of warn you of that. This is a much harder book to find than some of these other ones. But if you can find the book, it's worth whatever you'll pay for the book. He does do a lot of high level sort of ways to think about writing. So it is, I think, a book that's useful to people who aren't writing comics, but just to creative writings, people who are creative writers generally. But it's, of course, especially useful to people who are writing comics. Now, it's not super practical. It's a bit more high level, but I think, again, it's got some practical advice in it. And it has, I think, just a nice, fresh approach. He really is approaching writing for comics from the point of view of, okay, how do we just treat comics like a serious literature? How do we take all the things we would do in other mediums and do them here too? And Moore, along with a number of other writers, was one of the sort of, figures best known for revolutionizing comics to make them a bit more, literary and dark and weird. Now I think there's sort of problems with how that has played out. And I think there's problems with how Moore and his ilk kind of washed away some of the things that happened before them. But nevertheless, it's a fantastic book if you can find it, that really does a lot uh, to give you a different way of thinking about moving into a medium like comics. And just thinking visually, Moore is a very visual thinker. And I think, whatever your medium is, you need to be a visual thinker in many respects to be a modern writer. Another book that is sort of genre specific, but I still think is fantastic, whether you like the genre or not, is The Writing Moment by Daniel Scott Tisdale. And The Writing Moment is subtitled A Practical Guide to Creating Poems. So even if you're not a poet, I really advise this book. One, because, maybe you want to try your hand at poetry, but two, uh, this is a book that is organized around different techniques, and it really cycles through different ways of writing. It gets, again, it's poetry specific, but I think a lot of what you do in poetry is the same stuff you need to do in fiction, same stuff you need to do in screenwriting. I say this as a poet. I'm an award-winning poet who's also written fiction, who's also done screenplays. I will tell you that poetry is at the heart of all these things for me. Not that I write a ton of poems anymore. I do, but I don't focus on poetry the way I focus on other things. But the techniques of poetry are the techniques of literary art. The techniques of poetry are things that are going to carry over into other forms. So even if you never want to publish a poem, never want to really write a good poem, it really, I think, behooves you to learn how to write poems and to do experiments. Poetry is a great place to experiment, to increase your ability to write, to really grow as a writer by trying different things. And Tisdale's book is the best. It's really the only good book of poetry writing that I've ever seen. I wish I could say it was the best one, and it is the best one. But I wish it had a competitor, frankly. I wish there was another book of poetry that was even half decent that I could recommend to you alongside this book. And I can't. If you know one, let me know. Maybe I've missed it. But every book of poetry I've ever read, except for this one, is so boring, is so blunt, is just stuck in the 1800s in a weird sort of way. The 19th century is like the farthest they get. Tisdale is really in the now. He's looking at, how things used to be and what is the tradition, how to follow in the footsteps of the tradition, but also, as a modern poet who's working now, what are the things that people can do now? What are the different things you can do different from how the Blake would have done it, or different from how, Shelley might have done things. What are the techniques you could use? There's a lot of exercises in this book. Wonder Book also is a great book for exercises. It really is a book that encourages you to write, as does Wonder Book. Gives you the tools with which to write. It gives you exercises and prompts. It really helps you understand the process and complete the process. It demystifies the process, but I think it has a healthy emphasis on creativity and kind of what that means. And again, I would really recommend you check this book out, even if you don't care about poetry. It will make you a better writer because Tisdall is a great writer who has a lot of flexibility and also knows how to teach writing. Another book that I really like to recommend is The Fire and Fiction by Donald Moss. Now, Donald Moss is actually a literary agent, but he has a sort of side career writing books about creative writing. And he's done a lot of books. He's got a lot of good books. I think his books are, substantially good. There's some of the better books out there, but I like The Fire and Fiction in particular. It's more focused on novel writing. But I like it because it digs into a lot of things that I think it's a very practical book, and a very, technique focused book in many ways. But he also isn't afraid to talk about kind of the big picture side of things. Um, and he talks a lot about things that I haven't seen other creative writers talk about too well, like how do you, what are some of the techniques of hyper reality as a style? So writing satire and parody, for example, he delves into that a little bit and other, hyper real techniques. Uh, he really gets into tension and this thing he calls micro tensions, which is a fantastic uh, set of ideas. The Fire and Fiction is sort of is a title that sort of connects to this later idea in the book that you can have, of course, tension in a story where things are tense. There's some mystery, some suspense. And he gets into, yes, people talk about that in this broad scale, but there's a small scale where you really need it more, on the level of a sentence. Like, how do you make a sentence hold attention or a sentence hold some conflict? And so on. He gets into things like how do you make characters afraid? He gets into things like, what is it? How do you link details and emotions? So it's a nice high level book in that sense. It has some sort of lower, more intro level points where I think it's helpful, but it's also a very high level book in a disguised way. And Mass's books are fantastic books in that sort of way. Again, if you don't know his work, I'd recommend really any of his books, but The Fire and Fiction is the one I sometimes will tell people to start with. It's probably one of his less popular books, but I think it's one of his better ones. I also like to recommend a screenwriting book, even if you're not a screenwriter. Two screenwriting books, really, even if you're not a screenwriter. So the one is, of course, no surprise, Robert McKee's Story, which really is, again, focused on screenwriting and how to be a screenwriter. And McKee's, again, there's a way in which this book is out of date, right? His prime example is Casablanca. Not that Casablanca is out of date, but we don't write movies that way anymore. Now, should we? Chinatown, Casablanca, these are the scripts that he sort of returns to again and again. Is he right to return to them again and again? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. McKee this is a book you have to read with a healthy level of skepticism because he makes a lot of proclamations and he has a very declarative style. And I think that it is good and bad. So the style of this book, the declarative style that McKee has, where he's just making these proclamations, it does a few things. One thing it does is it browbeats writers into submission. So you have to sort of be aware when you're reading the book that if you read carefully, uh, he indicates that these are the general kind of guiding principles that he believes are the best. And um, he does take the time to indicate that there's other ways of writing. But I don't think he makes it obvious that there's other ways of writing. I don't think he makes it clear that those other ways of writing are ways you can write. He really sort of brings them up and dismisses as things you can't really be doing if you're going to have a serious career. I don't agree with that premise. I think we can see many examples, particularly in the modern age, of people who have done what he calls anti-structure or anti-story techniques, or mini story techniques, and so on. Now, so that can work very well. Correct. Hollywood isn't focused on them. Yes, it's harder to do those things, but more than ever before, there's an independent space outside of the control of Hollywood where it's possible to exist. So, on one hand, I think McKee is uh, a bit too bold and a bit too forward in what he says, and it tends to kind of browbeat writers into agreeing with him. And so there's an unfortunate class of writers who ends up agreeing with everything he says. And those people are insufferable. And they have problems in an industry that has moved beyond what McKee is talking about. It's a much more diverse industry. Perhaps you could say it shouldn't be as diverse. Perhaps I don't mean in terms of the people in it. I mean in terms of the storytelling styles. Um, McKee, wants it one way. And he argues that because it's not this way that I want it, we have all the problems that we have today. And so, on one hand, it's a tough book to recommend because it is very didactic and it's very much telling you how to do things. And so, there's a part of me, as the guy who has a podcast called Writing the Wrong Way, who wants to say to you, forget about McKee. But the other thing I think that it's easy to overlook is he's right about almost everything. I don't agree with most of what he says, but I agree that he is right about mostly what he says. And what I mean by that is you have to understand like the default position, the kind of rules of writing that I think, you often want to break, right? This is writing the wrong way. I'm the guy who's going to tell you how to write the wrong way. But I will still say, as McKee will say, um, first you learn the rules, then you start to break them. And I think the problem a lot of writers have is they don't take the time to learn the rules. They don't take the time to learn the principles and the guidelines and the things that have been working historically. Do those things still work? I would say in many cases, no. In many cases, they don't work. In many cases, the three-act structure that McKee will talk about is one I rail against. But again, it's really not McKee who's talking about the three-act structure all the time. McKee he gets into it, but he acknowledges very cleanly and clearly, hey, there's other act structures. Yes, he recommends one over the others, but he'll point out that that's a recommendation. It's not the law. And the definition that McKee gives of an act structure and the options that McKee talks about for alternative act structures, absolutely correct. So it's a book that really has more in it than it seems like there is. Often what he'll do if you read it carefully, and I've read this book many times, I think one of the better books you can find. And McKee is one of the best writers you can find on creative writing, but he's very much a structuralist and a formalist, as am I. And I think there's a level where it turns people off, because what he'll do is he'll say, hey, here's how stories work. There's 20 things, that happen in a story, that 20 things that you can do. Say, I'm just pulling the number 20 out of the air, but he'll do things like this. He'll go, hey, there's 20 things that you can do in a story. Three of them are the ones you should do. And then he'll dig into those three. But he'll acknowledge first, hey, there's these 17 other things. Mostly you don't want to do those things, but you could do them. And hey, here's the list of the people who've done them and where it worked. Are you going to be one of the those people? Well, who knows? Probably not. Probably you're better off focusing on these three things. So a lot of times people criticize McKee. They're not looking closely at what he's saying, partly because he's trying to guide them in a certain direction. You don't have to go in the direction McKee is guiding you. He's telling you all the right stuff, but then he starts to guide you in a direction. And what I would say is pay attention to what he's telling you, but don't always pay attention to the direction he wants you to go. But in terms of just understanding structure, which I think is the hardest thing for writers to understand, how the structure of story works because it's invisible. I would say McKee is probably the best person you read. Amnon Bookbinder, who wrote a book, The Way of the Screenwriter. This is another book I like to recommend on screenwriting, but also just on storytelling. And it's again a great book that gives really precise examples. Bookbinder takes a number of examples. He goes exhaustively through those examples from different genres and so on. He's very structurally focused, like McKee is. You'll see a lot of overlap between those two books. And again, even if you're not a screenwriter, these are good books because they get into story structure. And a lot of that structure transits over to other things like the short story and the novel and so on. But Bookbinder brings in there's a couple concepts I think that he brings in that are a little easier to understand, like the concept of a spell, which McKee doesn't really get into in a clear way. He does get into it, but not in a clear way. Bookbinder has a very clear way of writing, even though he's saying many of the same things. He has a clear way of breaking down how stories tend to operate. And I think it's just a bit more of a engaging book in the sense that he has the ability to just make it seem more possible to be a writer than sometimes McKee makes it seem. And Bookbinder also, I think, has a really fantastic way of thinking about conflict in a scene. And if you're a screenwriter, again, I would say those are the two books that you really need. But if you're not a screenwriter, there's still great books to look at to learn story structure, because story structure is the fundamentally difficult thing to learn. And the last example that I'll give you, the last little, thing I'll leave you with here, the last book. No, I just lost it. Hang on. I'll pull up. So it's a book called The First 5 Pages by Noah Lukeman. So let's just take a look here for a second. Sorry, I just had lost my note about it. So The First 5 Pages by Noah Lukeman is a book that sometimes it's hard to find, but you can get the book still. So the subtitle of this book is A Writer's Guide to Staying Out of the Projection Pile. Again, Noah Lukeman is an agent like Donald Maas or was an agent. And, and Lukeman, I believe he's still an agent. So the First 5 Pages is really a book that is more useful in the editing process than anything else. It's not really going to help you write a lot necessarily, but it's very focused on editing. It's focused on, it's a little out of date. There's a number of things he says in the book that are somewhat out of date. But there's a lot here. If you can just overlook the things that are out of date and don't get hung up on them, there's a lot here about how to make your writing strong. And that core concept that if you're submitting the work out to other places, if you're sending out to a publisher or sending out, to anyone, to an agent, to a publisher, to any other person, the reality that they're going to just read a couple pages. They're going to flip at the first 5 pages and then make a decision whether or not to read the rest of it. Sometimes they won't even get 5 pages into it where they make that decision. That's a core insight that writers have a hard time grasping. And I think he not only does a good job of selling that idea, which you need to understand, but he also does a good practical job of, okay, well, here are the common problems. Here's some of the higher level things that to do to make your writing better. Uh, so it's a really good book on, it's one of the better intro books on editing. There's not a lot of really good books on editing, unfortunately. Again, I'm trying to write one of these, but I've got other things that I'm doing, so it has been taking a long time. But this is probably the best one you can find that's focused on editing, that really is practical, actionable, and logical and sensible. And it really helps you think about, more than anything that it says, it really helps you think about how someone else is looking at the book, particularly how a professional is looking at the book. And one of the nice things about Noah Lukeman's The First Five Pages also is if you can't afford the book, if you don't have a bunch of money, you can email Noah Lukeman and he will send you the book for free. So he's very generous in that respect. He's very good about, getting in touch. He's also made his audiobook edition of it free. He made an audiobook edition and you can listen to it free if you want, if you like audiobooks or, just like free things. Again, lukeman.com, and you'll find, the first five pages. You can get the book elsewhere. I would recommend the book, but he does have those options for you, which are nice, to look into it, to get into it as a book that you may want to check out, especially though if you've written a manuscript already. So it's really useful if you're going through a manuscript again to kind of get a better handle on how others are going to see that manuscript, especially how professionals are going to see that manuscript, and how you might improve the manuscript as a result. So this has been my sort of primer, 13 books that for a creative writer. I hope that is a good way in for you to a field that I think is a bit mystifying and a bit too large. Creative writing has become a weird industry. We have almost more creative writing books than there are creative writers. And so it can be hard to get into. I read almost all these books. Fortunately or unfortunately for you, not so much for me. I read all those books pretty much. There's lots of other great ones. There's lots of other terrible ones. So that's not the end all be all, but it is a great place, I think, to start. 13, books. If you read one a month, you'll have over a year's worth of reading there. And especially, if you're doing exercises and things, it may take you actually a good amount of time to read those books. So that'll keep you going for a little while. It'll really help give you a nice grounding and a basis for a creative career if you're just starting out. You could do way worse than check those books out and follow what those books say. So maybe there's more that you want to do. Maybe you have a niche you want to move into where, you might find some more practical, specific advice. If so, please let me know if there's any good books that you find. And also, again, I'm trying to write some of these books. I just have not prioritized it, frankly, of late because I'm trying to focus on my creative work first and my nonfiction work second. But I am sort of ramping up a little bit. So, let me know what you want to know and keep writing the wrong way.